You people always sneak into places you don't belong." The words echoed cold and sharp across the concrete walls of the underground parking garage, bouncing off steel beams and polished car doors like they had been said 100 times before, like they belonged there more than she did. And Ava Williams stopped mid-step beside her aging silver sedan, her hand still wrapped around the key fob, the faint click of the unlocked door fading into silence as every nearby sound seemed to dim around her. The low hum of fluorescent lights overhead casting a pale glow across the gray floor, her reflection faintly visible in the tinted window beside her, steady, composed, unreadable, while a few feet away Emily Carter stood with arms folded, her designer heels tapping once against the concrete. Impatience etched into her posture, and Richard Carter lingered just behind her, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket like this moment was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His eyes scanning Ava from head to toe with quiet dismissal, the kind that didn't need to be spoken to be understood, and yet he spoke anyway, his voice measured, almost casual, as if issuing a polite correction instead of an accusation, saying this level was reserved, that employees should park elsewhere, that rules existed for a reason, but beneath it all was something colder, something sharper, something that pressed into the air between them, tightening it, shaping it, defining who belonged and who did not. And Ava said nothing at first, not because she didn't have words, but because she understood the weight of silence, the way it could hold more power than any immediate response, her fingers tightening slightly around the keys, her shoulders rising and falling in a slow, controlled breath as she looked at them, really looked, taking in every detail, the polished car behind them, the confidence in their stance, the certainty that they were right, that they were in control of this moment. And somewhere in the distance a car door slammed, the sound echoing faintly before fading into the stillness again, and Emily let out a short laugh, glancing at Richard as if sharing a private joke, her voice lighter now, but no less cutting as she repeated herself, clearer this time, slower, as if explaining something obvious, as if kindness was optional and patience already spent. And Richard reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen as if already prepared for what came next, calling security, escalating something that could have ended in a single sentence, a single acknowledgement, a single moment of basic respect, but instead stretching it, amplifying it, turning it into something else entirely, something heavier, something deliberate. And Ava finally shifted, not backward, not away, but forward just enough to close the distance by a single step, the soft scrape of her shoe against the concrete barely audible, her gaze steady as she met theirs without flinching, without raising her voice, without giving them what they expected. And in that quiet, in that pause that lingered just a second too long, something subtle changed, something neither of them noticed yet, something already set in motion long before this moment began. As the elevator at the far end of the garage chimed softly and the doors slid open behind her, lights spilling out across the floor, unnoticed by the couple standing in front of her, but not by Ava, who heard it, who felt it, who understood exactly what was coming next. The elevator doors remained open behind Ava, a quiet rectangle of light spilling across the concrete floor, but she did not turn yet, not immediately. Instead, she held her ground for one more second, long enough for the silence to stretch, long enough for the tension to settle into the space between them, and Richard's thumb finally moved across his phone screen. The faint tap echoing louder than it should have as he spoke under his breath about unauthorized access and protocol, his tone clipped, efficient, like he had done this before, like it was routine to decide who stayed and who left. And Emily shifted her weight, crossing one arm tighter against her body while the other hand brushed invisible dust from her sleeve, her eyes never leaving Ava, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with certainty, the kind that came from years of never being questioned, never being corrected. And somewhere above them a ventilation fan hummed steadily, pushing cool air through the garage that carried the faint scent of oil and rubber, grounding the moment in something physical, something real. While Ava finally spoke, her voice calm, level, measured in a way that did not rise to meet their tone, did not challenge it, but also did not retreat, simply stating that she was parked in a designated space, that her credentials were valid, that there was no issue to resolve. And for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Richard's face, not recognition, not understanding, but irritation, as if the conversation had taken a turn he did not approve of, and he stepped closer, closing the distance just enough to reassert control, his presence deliberate, calculated, his words slower now, more pointed, emphasizing policy, hierarchy, the structure that defined the company they both occupied, except he believed he stood at the top of it. And Ava listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, the faint reflection of the overhead lights catching in her eyes as if they held something deeper, something unspoken, and Emily let out a soft exhale, shaking her head slightly, as if disappointed, as if the outcome was already decided and this was merely the final step. Her voice lowering but not softening as she suggested that some people confused access with entitlement, that rules existed to maintain order, that without them everything would fall apart. And Ava absorbed every word, not reacting outwardly, but storing them, placing them carefully in a space where nothing was lost, nothing was ignored, while the sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly from the far end of the garage, security responding to the call, their presence still distant but inevitable, and Richard glanced briefly in that direction, satisfied, reassured, his confidence settling back into place like a well-fitted jacket, and Ava finally turned her head slightly, just enough to glance toward the open elevator, the lights still waiting, steady and patient, as if it had all the time in the world, and she pressed the key fob once more, the soft beep of her car locking behind her marking a quiet decision, a transition, and when she looked back at them, there was no anger in her expression, no urgency, only a calm that did not belong to someone being dismissed, but to someone who already understood how this moment would end, even if they did not, and the elevator doors began to close with a smooth, almost silent motion, the light narrowing, framing her for just an instant longer before slipping away, leaving the couple standing in the same cold glow of the garage, unaware that the next time they saw her, the ground beneath their certainty would no longer exist. The elevator carried Ava upward in near silence, the soft hum of cables and machinery blending with the steady rhythm of her breathing as the numbers above the door ticked higher one by one, each floor separating her further from the echoing concrete and the voices that had filled it moments before, and she stood still in the center of the space, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward, the faint reflection of her figure mirrored in the brushed steel walls around her, calm, composed, unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. Yet something in her gaze held a quiet intensity, a focus that had been there long before the garage, long before the words, long before Richard Carter had ever reached for his phone. And when the elevator chimed again, the doors slid open to a different world entirely, warm light spilling across polished marble floors, the air carrying a subtle scent of citrus and clean linen, a stark contrast to the cold oil and concrete below, and Ava stepped out without hesitation, her pace measured, deliberate, heels clicking softly against the floor in a steady rhythm that echoed down the wide corridor, drawing brief glances from passing employees who instinctively shifted their posture as she passed, some straightening, some lowering their voices, not out of fear, but out of recognition of presence, of authority that did not need to announce itself. And at the far end of the hall, a set of glass doors reflected the skyline beyond, the morning sun filtering through in long beams that stretched across the floor like silent pathways, and Ava moved through them with ease, her reflection merging with the city outside for a brief moment before disappearing into the executive wing, where everything felt quieter, more controlled, more deliberate, and inside a large conference room a dozen voices filled the space, low conversations layered over the shuffle of papers and the occasional tap of a pen against glass, a meeting already in motion, already structured around decisions that assumed a certain order of power, a certain hierarchy that had not yet been challenged, and Richard Carter sat near the center of the table, his posture relaxed, one arm resting against the chair, speaking with the same confidence he carried downstairs, his voice steady as he discussed projections and policies, unaware that the foundation beneath his certainty was already shifting, while Emily sat beside him, scrolling briefly through her phone before setting it down, her expression composed, her attention divided between the conversation and the expectation that the day would unfold exactly as planned. exactly as it always had. And then the door at the far end of the room opened, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to interrupt the rhythm of the conversation, just enough for a few heads to turn, and Ava stepped inside, the light from the hallway framing her for a brief second before the door closed quietly behind her. And the room did not fall silent immediately, not yet, but something subtle shifted, a pause. In speech, a hesitation in movement, as if the air itself had recognized something before the people in it had. And Ava walked forward, her gaze steady, her expression calm, moving toward the head of the table with a quiet certainty that did not ask permission, did not wait for acknowledgement. And one by one the voices faded, replaced by a growing stillness that spread across the room like a slow ripple, until Richard finally looked up, his words cutting off mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing, slightly in confusion, trying to place her, trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the one he had already decided on minutes earlier. And for the first time that morning, uncertainty touched his expression, faint but undeniable. As Ava reached the front of the room and rested her hand lightly against the back of the chair at the head of the table, the position no one had occupied yet, the position everyone had been waiting for, and she looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn before letting the silence settle completely, long enough for every assumption to surface, long enough for every memory of the garage to return uninvited. And then she spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying effortlessly through the room without force, without strain, as if it belonged there, as if it always had. "Good morning," Ava said, her voice steady, calm, carrying across the room with a quiet authority that did not rise in volume but in presence. And the effect was immediate. Conversations that had already begun did not resume, chairs that had shifted stilled in place, and the faint hum of the building seemed suddenly louder in the absence of voices, as if the entire floor had paused to listen. And Ava let her hand rest lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table for just a moment, longer before pulling it out and sitting down with a smooth, unhurried motion, claiming the space without announcement, without explanation, simply by being exactly where she belonged. And a subtle shift passed through the room, a ripple of realization that moved from one person to the next, visible in small ways, a straightened posture, a quick glance exchanged, a hand that stopped mid-note, and Richard Carter remained still, his gaze fixed on her, the earlier certainty in his expression now fractured by something less stable, something searching, as if his mind was moving quickly through possibilities, trying to reconcile timelines, positions, assumptions that no longer aligned. And Emily sat beside him, her back straight, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the table, the confidence she carried downstairs now quiet, contained, replaced by a careful stillness that suggested awareness without yet admitting it. And Ava looked down briefly at the folder placed neatly in front of her, then back up, meeting the eyes of each person in the room with deliberate intention, not rushing, not skipping anyone, allowing the silence to deepen just enough to settle into something unmistakable, something that demanded attention without asking for it. And when she spoke again, her tone remained even, measured, but there was a clarity in it now, a precision that cut through any remaining uncertainty, introducing herself not with emphasis, not with force, but with the simple statement of her name and her role, Chief Executive Officer, newly appointed, effective immediately. And the words landed differently than any raised voice ever could, not loud, not dramatic, but final. And across the table someone shifted in their seat. Another person cleared their throat softly, the smallest sounds amplified in the weight of the moment, and Richard's hand, still resting near his phone, tightened slightly, the memory of the parking garage no longer distant, no longer separate, but unfolding in real time against what stood before him now. And Ava continued without pause, outlining the agenda for the meeting, her voice steady as she referenced strategic reviews, internal culture assessments, operational standards, each word deliberate, each phrase chosen with care, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if this was simply another meeting, another day, another routine moment in the life of the company. And yet beneath that calm delivery was something unmistakable, a quiet control of the room, of the direction, of the narrative itself. And when she reached for the remote beside her, lifting it with a small, precise movement, A few heads turned instinctively toward the large screen mounted on the wall behind her, anticipation building not from volume or urgency, but from the weight of everything that had already been set in motion. And Ava paused for just a fraction of a second before pressing the button, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, her presence filling the space in a way that left no room for interruption. And in that suspended moment, before anything appeared on the screen, before any truth was revealed, the room held its breath, balanced on the edge of something none of them could yet fully see, but all of them were about to understand. The screen flickered to life behind Ava, a soft glow spreading across the glass surface as the first frame appeared. And at first no one spoke because it took a second for recognition to settle in, a second for context to form. The grainy angle of a security camera, the familiar concrete pillars, the low ceiling, the cold lighting of the parking garage, and then the voices began, clear, unmistakable. Every word captured with precision, every tone preserved exactly as it had been spoken just minutes earlier, and Emily's voice echoed through the room, sharper now in the silence of the conference space, stripped of its casual delivery, revealing something more deliberate beneath it. And Richard's measured responses followed, the calm authority, the assumption, the certainty, all of it replaying without interruption, without distortion, exactly as it had happened. And around the table the reactions came slowly, not loud, not immediate, but visible in the smallest details, a tightening of lips, a shift in posture, eyes lowering to the table, then lifting again toward the screen as if hoping they had misunderstood, as if context might somehow change what was already clear, but it did not. It only became clearer, heavier, more impossible to ignore, and Richard did not move at first, his gaze fixed forward, his jaw set, the sound of his own voice now detached from him, no longer controlled, no longer framed by his intention, but existing on its own, exposed in a way he had never anticipated. And Emily's composure began to fracture in subtle ways, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, her shoulders drawing in just slightly, as if the space around her had shifted, as if the room itself had turned from something familiar into something uncertain. And Ava remained still, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her expression unchanged, not watching them, not reacting to them, but allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to, without interference, without commentary. And when the clip reached the point where Richard mentioned policy and access, where Emily repeated her words with quiet emphasis, the room seemed to contract, the air growing heavier, more defined, until even the faint hum of the building felt distant. And then the video ended, the screen returning to a neutral stillness, the light dimming slightly as if the room itself was exhaling. And for a moment no one spoke, no one moved, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to interpret, only the reality of what had just been seen. And Ava let that silence settle fully, letting it stretch long enough that it could not be dismissed, long enough that it could not be softened by immediate explanation. And then she leaned forward just slightly, her voice entering the space again with the same calm precision, not raised, not sharp, but carrying a weight that held the entire room in place. And she spoke about culture, about responsibility, about the difference between authority and integrity, her words measured, deliberate, not directed at any single person and yet impossible for anyone to avoid. And as she spoke, Richard finally shifted. In his seat, his confidence no longer anchored, his certainty replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, and Emily lowered her gaze briefly, the reflection of the screen still faintly visible in her eyes, as if the moment had marked something that could not be undone. And Ava finished her sentence without pause, without emphasis, simply allowing the meaning to exist on its own, filling the room with a clarity that did not need reinforcement. And when she leaned back again, the silence returned, deeper now, heavier, no longer empty but full of understanding, full of consequence, full of something that had already begun to change everything. No one reached for their phone, no one shuffled papers, no one even cleared their throat this time, because the silence after Ava's words was different now. It was not confusion, it was not hesitation, it was recognition settling into place, heavy and unavoidable, like a truth that had finally been spoken out loud. and Ava did not rush to fill it. She did not soften it. She simply allowed it to exist, her gaze drifting briefly toward the glass wall behind the conference table where the city stretched out in clean lines of steel and sunlight. Distant traffic moving like a quiet pulse far below, a world that continued forward without pause, indifferent to what had just shifted inside this room. And she stood slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled precision she had carried from the moment she stepped out of the elevator, her chair sliding back with a soft, deliberate sound against the floor, and as she moved toward the window, the light caught along the edge of her silhouette, outlining her in a way that felt almost still, almost suspended, as if the moment itself had slowed, and behind her no one spoke, not because they were waiting for permission, but because they no longer had anything certain to say, and Richard Carter sat motionless, his earlier confidence now replaced by something quieter, something internal, his eyes lowered for the first time not in dismissal but in thought, in reflection, as if replaying the sequence of events not as a justification but as a realization, each word from the garage now carrying a weight it did not have before, and Emily's posture had changed as well, the tension in her shoulders no longer rigid but drawn inward, her gaze no longer fixed outward but softened, uncertain, as if she had been forced to see something she had never examined closely before, something that did not fit neatly into the assumptions she had always relied on, and Ava rested her hand lightly against the cool glass, her fingertips barely touching the surface as she looked out. Over the city, the reflection faint but present, her own image layered against the skyline, calm, composed, unchanged, and when she spoke again her voice was quieter, not weaker, but more grounded, more reflective, as if the purpose of the moment had shifted from exposure to understanding, and she spoke about what a company truly was, not just numbers or strategy or position, but people, decisions, the small moments that revealed character when no one thought they were being watched, the choices made in places that did not feel important, that did not seem visible, and how those choices shaped everything that followed. And as her words settled into the room, they did not feel like a lecture. They did not feel like an accusation. They felt like something else, something closer to a mirror, something that each person in the room had to face on their own terms. And Ava turned slightly then, not fully, just enough that her presence re-entered the center of the space, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, and the quiet strength of it filled the room in a way that left no need for raised voices or sharp conclusions. And outside the sunlight shifted slightly against the glass, a passing cloud softening the brightness for just a moment before it returned again, steady, constant, and inside the room something had changed just as quietly, just as permanently, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity, and Ava let the silence return once more, not empty, but complete, as if everything that needed to be said had already been understood. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the weight of everything that had just unfolded needed time to settle into something real, something irreversible, and Ava remained where she stood near the glass, not watching for reactions, not waiting for acknowledgement, but simply allowing the room to find its own balance again. And it was Richard Carter who moved first, not with the same certainty he carried before, but with a hesitation that seemed foreign to him, his hand lifting slightly from the table before settling back down again, his posture adjusting as if he were trying to find a position that fit this new reality, one where his voice no longer led, where his assumptions no longer held. And when he finally spoke, it was quieter, not weak, but measured in a way that acknowledged something had changed, that something had been revealed not just to others but to himself. And he chose his words carefully, more carefully than before, addressing Ava not as an obstacle, not as a challenge, but as the authority she had already proven herself to be. And there was no defense in his tone, no attempt to reframe what had been seen, only an effort to respond, to bridge the gap between what he had been and what he now understood he needed to become. And Emily followed a moment later, her voice softer than it had been in the garage, the sharp edges gone, replaced by something more reflective, something uncertain but honest, as if the clarity of the moment had stripped away the comfort of assumption and left only the truth of what had been said and done. and around the table others began to shift as well, not speaking yet, but listening differently, their attention no longer divided, no longer passive, but engaged in a way that suggested they were witnessing not just a correction of behavior, but a redefinition of standard. And Ava turned back toward the table fully now, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and she listened without interruption, without reaction that could be mistaken for approval or dismissal, simply allowing the words to exist, to be spoken, to take their place in the sequence of what had already occurred. And when the room quieted again, when every attempt to respond had settled into silence, she stepped forward, returning to the head of the table with the same controlled movement, the same quiet certainty, and she placed both hands lightly against the surface, not as a gesture of dominance, but as an anchor, grounding the moment in something tangible, something present. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone now, not corrective, not reflective, but resolute, defining what would come next rather than what had already happened. And she spoke about accountability, not as punishment, but as responsibility, about leadership not as position, but as example, about the expectation that every action, every word, no matter how small or unseen, would align with the values the company claimed to hold. And as she spoke, there was no resistance in the room, no challenge, no interruption, only a quiet acceptance that what had been said could not be undone, but what followed could still be shaped. And outside the window the city continued its steady motion, unchanged, while inside something far more subtle had shifted, something that would not be visible from a distance, but would be felt in every decision moving forward, in every interaction, in every moment that no one thought would matter. And Ava finished her sentence without emphasis, without finality, simply letting the meaning settle where it needed to. And in that stillness that followed, it was clear that the moment had passed from revelation into consequence, from exposure into transformation, and nothing in that room would return to what it had been before. The room did not rush to move forward. It adjusted, slowly, as if every person inside it understood that something deeper than policy had just been rewritten. And Ava remained at the head of the table, her posture steady, her presence no longer something to question but something to align with. And she allowed a brief pause to exist before continuing, not to extend tension, but to give space for what had already settled to take root. And when she spoke again, her tone carried a quiet finality, not harsh, not punitive, but clear in a way that left no room for misinterpretation, outlining the immediate steps that would follow, a formal review of conduct, a reassessment of leadership roles, and a renewed commitment to values that could not remain theoretical, but had to be visible in every interaction, every decision, every moment that no one thought would be noticed. And as she spoke, there was no resistance, only a quiet acknowledgement moving through the room, reflected in lowered gazes, in still hands, in the absence of interruption. And Richard Carter listened without shifting this time, his earlier instinct to control replaced by something more deliberate, something introspective, his shoulders no longer squared in authority, but settled in acceptance. And when Ava finished outlining the changes, he spoke again, not quickly, not defensively, but with a measured sincerity that had not been present before, acknowledging the impact of his words, not just how they had sounded, but what they had represented. And there was no attempt to justify, no attempt to diminish, only a recognition that what had been exposed could not be unseen. And Emily followed, her voice quieter still, her composure now rooted not in confidence, but in awareness, choosing her words with care, as if each one carried weight, as if each one needed to reflect something different than before. And around them the others at the table remained attentive, not as observers, but as participants in something that now extended beyond the individuals involved, something that spoke to the culture they were all responsible for shaping. And Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, not offering approval or disapproval, simply allowing the words to exist, to stand on their own. And when the room fell silent once more, she gave a single nod, not as forgiveness, not as closure, but as acknowledgement that what needed to be said had been said. And she moved forward, guiding the meeting back into structure, into purpose, into the work that still needed to be done. But the tone had shifted, the rhythm had changed, and every voice that followed carried a new awareness, a new precision, as if each person understood that what had once been overlooked could no longer be ignored. And as the discussion continued, the earlier tension did not disappear. It transformed, settling into something quieter but more enduring, something that would not fade with time, but would shape the way each person in that room moved forward. And Ava remained composed throughout, her presence anchoring the space, not through force, but through consistency, through clarity, through the quiet strength of someone who did not need to prove authority because it was already understood. And outside the glass walls, the sunlight shifted slightly again, tracing new lines across the floor, marking the passage of time, while inside the room something far more lasting had been set into motion, something that would not be measured in minutes or hours, but in the choices that followed long after this meeting ended. The meeting ended without a formal signal, no closing remark, no sharp dismissal, just a gradual stillness as voices faded and chairs shifted quietly against the floor. One by one, people gathering their notes with a new kind of care, a new awareness that lingered in their movements. And Ava remained seated for a moment longer after the room began to empty, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her gaze lowered not in fatigue but in reflection, as if the weight of what had passed was not something to carry but something to understand. And when she finally stood, it was with the same calm precision that had defined every step she had taken that day, her chair sliding back softly as she turned toward the glass wall once more, the city beyond now brighter, the sunlight stretching farther across the skyline, illuminating every surface it touched. And behind her the last few voices disappeared into the hallway, the door closing gently, leaving the room in a quiet that felt complete, not empty, but resolved. And Ava walked slowly toward the window, her footsteps measured, the faint echo of each one dissolving into the stillness. And when she reached the glass, she paused, her reflection appearing clearly now against the backdrop of the city, no longer layered, no longer distant, but present, grounded, fully defined. And for a moment, she simply stood there, her hand resting lightly at her side, her shoulders relaxed, her expression calm, not triumphant, not satisfied, but steady, as if the purpose of the moment had never been to win, but to reveal, to shift, to realign something that had been unseen for too long. And far below, in the parking structure, cars continued to move in and out, unaware of what had unfolded above them, unaware that a single moment, a few words spoken in passing, had carried forward into something far greater than itself. And Ava's gaze drifted downward briefly, not searching, not lingering, just acknowledging the space where it had begun, where assumptions had been made, where silence had held its own kind of weight. And then she looked back out across the skyline, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet but certain, and the light shifted once more, reflecting softly across the glass, tracing the outline of her figure before fading into the wider view of the city. And in that stillness there were no words left to say, no actions left to take. Only the quiet understanding that what had changed would not return, that what had been revealed would not be forgotten. And Ava remained there for a moment longer before turning away, her steps carrying her forward with the same steady rhythm, leaving behind a room that would never feel quite the same again, a silence that spoke louder than anything that had been said, and a truth that would remain long after the echoes had faded.